I'm Connor Wold and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films, and this week we are going to be looking at the 2010 Oscars for the film The Kids Are All Right. But if you're new to this series, welcome. This is a series where I look at a movie that was nominated for Best Picture and I talk about why I think it's been forgotten. I choose one from every single year, starting with the year 2013, and we've been working our ways back. This is the second season of this series. Back in 2019, I did one where we started with the years 1988 and worked our years back. So if you want to see a big catalog of those videos, please do check those ones out. But we're going to be continuing the series once again, working our way back. So this week is the 2010 Oscars. Next week will be the 2009 Oscars. And essentially the show starts off with just giving a little bit of context, a little bit of history of where we were at the time, then transitions more into my thoughts on the movie, and then finally trying to answer that central question as to why it has been forgotten. And the 2010 Oscars happens to be one of the most egregious Oscar ceremonies, and Oscars really of the decade, I would say, or maybe of all time. Seemingly they picked every wrong choice looking back on it, and of course hindsight is 2020, but even the ceremony and the whole night was so weird. If you remember, this was the award show where Anne Hathaway and James Franco were the hosts, which are sort of notoriously some of the worst hosts of Oscar history. They had sort of the Anne Hathaway really excited kind of energy versus the sort of more low-key energy of James Franco, which totally clashed and didn't work together. And this was also a very new thing for the Oscars, having two actors host them. Most of the time, if it is an actor, it's also going to be a comedian. They're also sort of they were very much experimenting with this two-person format. The year before this, they had Alec Baldwin and Steve Martin, which went well, but it was very much seen as sort of the older Academy, and they wanted to try to maybe lighten things up, maybe make things a little bit more youth-centric. So they did these sort of two up-and-coming actors who were comedic actors, but weren't necessarily comedians getting their start in, say, late night or stand-up or stuff like that. They were very much actor-centric in the forefront, and their energies totally clashed. And there was reports where they were writing things, a couple days before the show, and there wasn't a lot of preparation, and then things changed. So there was sort of a bit of a craziness that way. And on top of that, this slate of films was some of the most seminal, I think, not only of this decade, but really of the 21st century. I mean, Toy Story 3, Inception, The Social Network. I mean, this wouldn't be rare to see on the top 10 of the decade or of the century lists. These movies are very well appreciated, very well celebrated, yet the Best Picture winner went to The King's Speech, which is a very good movie, I think, in its own right, and I actually think is a quite enjoyable movie, but it is undoubtedly not the best movie of this year, particularly when we have so many of these great movies also nominated. So it was a very sort of strange, what are the Oscars doing, weird period of their history. Other Best Picture nominees that I could have chose from were Winter's Bone, 127 Hours, Black Swan, True Grit, The Fighter. And this was also the year where Colin Firth and Natalie Portman both were sort of sweeping and were sort of locks on the night for who was going to win for Best Lead Actor and Actress. However, the supporting acting categories were a little bit up in the air. Both Bale and Melissa Leo were not, Bale didn't win at BAFTA, and Melissa Leo wasn't even nominated at BAFTA, so going to the Oscars night, I wasn't sure how much of an impact The Fighter would really have, but it ultimately did very well, getting both those wins on the night and getting that celebration from the American Academy branch. But for me, when deciding what movie to choose from, once again, similar to the past few weeks, it was obvious because out of all the movies that were nominated, I had seen all of them except for one. In this case, The Kids Are All Right. So I feel like that's a good, at least sort of indicator as to what has sort of stayed around. Why did someone recommend I should watch something like Winter's Bone or True Grit over something like The Kids Are All Right? Now, I thought maybe do something like 127 Hours because Danny Boyle has a very interesting filmography, but he has a lot of hits and is a celebrated filmmaker. Similarly with someone like Deborah Granick, who had Leave No Trace a couple years ago, which was her follow-up to Winter's Bone. So she's going to be, I think, a filmmaker who continues making films for years to come. But Lisa Cholodenko has sort of fallen away from films and transitioned more into television, doing series like Olive Kitteridge and Unbelievable most recently. So she's sort of gone to that lane. So I think in terms of her larger film relevance, she's maybe sort of fallen out of favor. Now I think she's doing great work and she is sort of a unique voice in her own right. But just from the fact that I hadn't even watched this movie, it seemed to be like this was not as well celebrated as something like an Inception. So transitioning into my thoughts, I enjoyed this movie. I think there were some really great things in it. The first one being that I found the movie to be very perceptive, particularly with its writing. That something like The Social Network, which of course won for Best Screenplay this year, is a really great screenplay because it's sort of elevated. There's a great rhythm to it, but it's not necessarily how people actually talk. It's kind of like how we wish people would talk, where the kids are all right, I think, are very perceptive onto how we actually do talk and how that changes between relationships. It's incredibly perceptive when it comes to that. So if you don't know, the movie is about a family with two moms who had their children through artificial insemination, and then one of the kids turns 18, so she goes out looking after the biological father and starts to develop a relationship, and sort of the drama from there ensues. And one example, I think, of the perceptiveness of this dialogue that I'm talking about is a scene between Mark Ruffalo's character, who is the biological father, meeting the two kids for the first time. There's these great little pauses and awkwardnesses and not knowing how to ask certain questions, or maybe answering a certain question in a weird way that makes them offended, and have these sort of weird sort of awkward pauses, but then one person is really enjoying the conversation but the other's not. It is a sort of weird kind of trifecta of a situation that's very hard to pull off, where it's very clear to understand where sort of relationships are building and where relationships are sort of falling apart, and how people think of the other characters. And it does that through the dialogue, but also sort of the lack of dialogue and the pauses in terms of the overlapping at certain times, the awkwardness that comes with that. But then in other scenes, the relationship in more private scenes between Annette Bening and Julianne Moore are very sort of natural and free-flowing, and feel like they have a relationship with each other. But versus the way they talk together at the family table is different. So what I appreciate through the writing is how perceptive it is in terms of how real world conversations occur and how they change between relationships, but also how really lived in. And it feels like Annette Bening and Julianne Moore, that they have been married for a long time, that they've been together for college. And along with the writing, the acting is really the sort of heart of this movie, particularly the three performances in Mark Ruffalo, Julianne Moore, and Annette Bening. My personal favorite, I think, being actually Julianne Moore, even though she was the one who didn't get nominated. Ultimately, a couple of years later, 3 years later, she wins for Still Alice, thankfully. But in particular, this movie, she's really great at, like I said, sort of changing her speed based on the relationships that she has, being the sort of mom figure at times, but also being the sort of more relaxed parental figure, and sort of the way Annette and her character's relationship in terms of their parenting relationship, but also their personal relationship. She has a lot of great funny moments, but also some serious sort of heartfelt emotional moments that don't feel like a big speechy moment, but do feel kind of like an emotional divulgence. Now, unfortunately, I think some of the problems with the movie also stem with her character, particularly in the sort of second half of the movie, where it seems like maybe we're running out a little bit of story, so the movie throws in a little bit of a unnecessary drama, I feel like, and feels, even though it's only 10 years old, there's elements that do feel dated in terms of how it's handled. But I don't want to spoil it, but sort of the relationship that she has with Mark Ruffalo's character and their dynamic, and how that sort of goes on to its own path, I felt was maybe a little bit dated. I don't think that necessarily would happen in today's kind of the landscape, but I also felt that it wasn't necessarily necessary for the story. I felt like just to add a little bit of an extra drama to it. And then also another kind of issue I think I had with the movie was how really the ending is kind of seemingly on a good end, but not really, and how the movie is really much more dramatic than I initially anticipated, which transitions now more into why I think this movie was forgotten. In one part, I think it's because it's not like super funny, but it's also not super sort of dramatic and serious, so it gets in sort of this weird landscape where It's not as much jokes that you can rewatch it all over the time, so say your favorite jokes, but it's also not sort of emotionally draining enough to you to sort of have that emotional catharsis kind of a movie. But it is definitely more serious, particularly in the second half, how it sort of deals with more of these complex family issues. And in these moments, I think it's a tough watch, which we mentioned so many times, how remembered movies, for example, oftentimes have to do with just being able to rewatch them, and particularly in today's reliance on Netflix and Blu-rays and whatnot, that people will often sort of throw on things that they like. And if this is a movie that's kind of in times tough and hard to sit through, that will be sort of difficult to do. Or it doesn't have a genre trope like many of the other movies nominated: Inception, action, True Grit, Western, Toy Story 3, family, emotional story. Whereas The Kids Are All Right is an adult drama, but it doesn't really fit into sort of a certain genre trapping, so it doesn't necessarily have a lot of hardcore fans. And then even certain smaller things that, certain things why this movie is maybe more forgotten is stuff like, the top 10 Westerns of the decade was a list that I did, and True Grit topped the list. So it was another reason why I could recommend and talk about True Grit. But The Kids Are All Right, I really didn't have a list to put that on, even if I wanted to put it on a list. So because of certain things of how we consume media and podcasts and rank things, I mean, certain movies, particularly the adult drama, kind of slips between the cracks. But like I said, I think it was maybe forgotten also because it's not super funny. It's not like overtly funny. It's also not overtly dramatic. It kind of slits it in between. And the ending doesn't necessarily feel, it's supposed to be like a good ending and a feel-good ending, but I couldn't help but feel like there's a lot of sort of loose ends and this family is kind of broken at the end, which was kind of, not necessarily the most glowing feeling coming out of the movie, that, oh my God, I want to recommend this to everyone, which hurts its chances. Maybe some of the themes wouldn't be as relevant today, so it's a little bit dated because of that sense. It's also not the signature performance from any of these three actors. I wouldn't say it's any of these three actors' best performances. And then there's, just larger things of, stories of women over 40 are increasingly rare. So maybe because audiences aren't trained to watch those sorts of movies. When we go back, into the past and watch where these movies are a little bit more prevalent, it's a little bit more of a stranger, different kind of experience where we don't have that sort of into. I mean, there's a bunch of, I think, reasons actually for why this has kind of been forgotten, but also it's not going to be totally forgotten. I mean, I think this is still a movie that you still see on streaming services. It still has the three actors giving great performances. These three actors who are also very well liked and appreciated, so it's not going to be completely forgotten and thrown to the side because of that. I still think it is going to be sort of semi-relevant at least, and not totally forgotten. Although out of the sort of movies that I listed here, I think it's probably one of the least ones. But I was pleasantly surprised when I watched the movie. Some really terrific dialogue, great performances. Unfortunately, I think it just went up against one of the best slates, Oscar slates of all time, with real classics like Inception, Social Network, True Grit. Those are really some of my favorite movies. Top 25, I think, of the decade. I did my top 10 of the 2010 series, so if you want to hear my thoughts on Toy Story 3 and True Grit and the Social Network, all talk about that. And The King's Speech even. So if you want to check out that series, it's called the Top 10 of the 2010s. I did that last summer. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know if you've seen The Kids Are All Right, what you thought of it. Would you have gone with a different movie? Maybe something like 127 Hours. That was one I was debating about too. All that kind of stuff I'd love to hear in the comments down below. But next week, I'm going to be talking about Precious, 2009's Precious, which I think will be a very interesting conversation. But until next time, stay tuned.